My name is Emily. I am 26 years old, and the air in my childhood living room felt so heavy I could barely draw breath into my burning lungs. I was standing by the old oak coffee table, staring blankly at the piece of paper in my father's hands. It was a cashier's check, holding the entirety of the college fund I had been assured of since I was a little girl. But he was not handing it to me. He was handing it to my younger sister, who was already smirking as her fingers curled around the edges of my future. When I found my voice, it was barely a whisper, asking him how he could do this after I had worked so tirelessly. He turned to me, his eyes devoid of any warmth, his face hardened into a mask of pure resentment. The silence stretched before he delivered the words that shattered my world. "You are not my daughter," my dad said, giving my sister my college fund, his voice dripping with venom. He told me I was a mistake, a secret my mother had kept, and that he owed me absolutely nothing. The room started spinning, the walls closing in as the man who had raised me erased my identity, leaving me drowning in betrayal, completely unaware that this brutal rejection was merely the beginning of a nightmare that would not end until...
To understand the sheer magnitude of that betrayal, you have to understand the dynamic of the house I grew up in. My father, Richard, a man of 55 years old, was always a stern and distant figure, but he was the only father I ever knew. My mother was the glue that held our fragile family together, a warm and radiant woman who always made sure I felt loved. She used to sit with me on the porch swing during the humid summer evenings, brushing my hair and whispering stories about the bright future she was planning for me. She was the one who started the college fund, putting away every spare dollar she could manage from her job at the local bakery. She told me that education was the key to true independence. I clung to those words, making them the foundation of my entire existence. But when I was just 14 years old, a sudden illness took her from us, leaving a massive, gaping hole in my life. The day we buried her was the day the warmth permanently left our home, replaced by a cold, suffocating silence. After my mother passed away, the subtle differences in how my father treated me compared to my sister became impossible to ignore. My sister Chloe, who is now 24 years old, became the undisputed center of his universe. She was the golden child, the one who could do absolutely no wrong in his eyes. If she wanted a new dress for a school dance, he would work overtime to buy it. If she failed a class, he would blame the teachers. Meanwhile, I was expected to pick up all the slack around the house. I became the unofficial housekeeper, the cook, and the quiet shadow that was only acknowledged when there was a chore to be done. I tried so hard to win his approval, bringing home straight-A report cards and keeping the house spotless, but my achievements were always met with a dismissive nod or a grunt. I convinced myself that he was just grieving in his own way, that the loss of my mother had broken something inside him, and that if I just proved my worth, he would eventually love me again. As the years dragged on, my desperate need for his validation slowly morphed into a quiet, fiercely independent determination. I realized that if I was going to make something of myself, I would have to do it entirely on my own. As soon as I was legally old enough to work, I started applying for every job I could find. I ended up getting hired at a run-down local diner on the edge of the highway, wiping down greasy tables and serving coffee to exhausted truck drivers. The pay was miserable, but every single paycheck felt like a tiny victory, a step toward the future my mother had envisioned for me. I opened my own bank account and started saving religiously. I denied myself new clothes, skipped going out with classmates, and poured all my energy into my studies and my shifts at the diner. I was exhausted all the time, my feet constantly aching, but I kept pushing forward because I knew the college fund my mother started was waiting for me as the final piece of the puzzle, the key to my escape. It was during those grueling years at the diner that I met the person who would become my absolute lifeline. Sarah, a 27-year-old waitress with a tough exterior and a heart of absolute gold, took me under her wing from my very first shift. She had been through her own share of family trauma and recognized the exhausted, desperate look in my eyes. During our short breaks behind the dumpster in the alleyway, we would sit on overturned milk crates and share our dreams. I told her all about my mother, the college fund, and my grand plan to escape this town and become an architect. Sarah would listen intently, blowing cigarette smoke into the night air, and tell me that I was the hardest worker she had ever met. She became the older sister I never had, the one who actually cheered for me and believed in my potential. Whenever I felt like giving up, Sarah was there to remind me of my worth and keep me focused on the finish line. refusing to let me succumb to the deep depression that constantly threatened me. Chloe, on the other hand, was living a completely different reality. While I was scrubbing dried ketchup off diner tables at midnight, she was out partying with her friends, crashing the cars my father bought her, and dropping out of community college after just one semester. She had no job, no ambition, and absolutely no concept of consequence. My father funded her lifestyle without question, draining his own savings to bail her out of every mess she created. I watched in silent frustration as he enabled her worst behaviors, but I kept my mouth shut because I did not want to jeopardize my access to the college fund. I naively believed that the money was sacred, a protected guarantee that even his blatant favoritism could not touch. I assumed that because it was my mother's dying wish, he would honor it when the time finally came for me to pack my bags and head off to the university. I was completely unaware that he viewed me not as a daughter, but as a living reminder of a past he desperately wanted to erase. The day the acceptance letter finally arrived in the mail, I felt like I was floating on a thick envelope from the state university, offering me a spot in their prestigious architecture program. I remember standing by the mailbox at the end of our driveway, clutching the letter to my chest, tears of pure joy streaming down my face. All the late nights, all the burned fingers at the diner, all the silent crying in my bedroom had finally paid off. I could almost hear my mother's voice whispering how proud she was of me. I ran into the house, practically vibrating with excitement, ready to share the news with my father. I found him in the kitchen, drinking a beer and looking over some bills. I slammed the letter onto the table, a massive smile plastered across my face, and told him I got in. I told him it was time to talk about the fund, to figure out how to transfer the money so I could pay the tuition deposit, completely oblivious to the brutal trap that was about to be sprung on me. He did not even look at the letter. He just took a slow sip of his beer, his eyes fixed on a spot on the wall behind me. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt incredibly dense, the joyous energy I had brought into the room evaporating in an instant. He told me to sit down, his tone completely devoid of any emotion. My heart started to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I pulled out a chair, a sickening feeling of dread settling in the pit of my stomach. That was when Chloe walked into the kitchen, looking smug and overly confident, carrying a brand new designer handbag that I knew cost more than my monthly rent would be. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms and staring at me with a look of pure pity mixed with amusement. My father reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slowly unfolded it and placed it on the table, keeping his hand firmly over it. It was a cashier's check, and the amount written on it represented everything I had ever worked for. I asked him what that was, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. He looked at Chloe, gave her a small, almost apologetic smile, and then turned his cold gaze back to me. He said that Chloe had decided to start a boutique clothing business online, and she needed seed money to get the inventory and marketing off the ground. He said she'd had a real vision, a real plan for her future, and that he needed his support right now. I stared at him, my brain struggling to process the words coming out of his mouth. I pointed out that Chloe had never held a job for more than a month, that she had no business experience, and that the money was supposed to be for my education. I reminded him of the vow he made to my mother, the vow to keep that money safe for me. I was begging, pleading with him to see reason, the desperation leaking into every syllable I spoke, hoping against hope that he was just playing some cruel, twisted joke on me. That was the exact moment he slid the check across the table to Chloe. She snatched it up instantly, a triumphant grin spreading across her face. I stood up, knocking my chair backward, and screamed at him. I asked him how he could be so incredibly cruel, how he could steal my future to fund her delusions. That was when the mask finally slipped entirely. His face contorted in rage, and he stood up, towering over me. He yelled that he was tired of my entitlement, tired of living at my face every single day. And then he dropped the bomb that destroyed my reality. He told me that shortly after my mother died, he found medical records she had hidden. He took a test. He told me, with absolute malice in his eyes, that I was not his biological daughter. I was the product of an affair my mother had years before she died. He said he kept the secret to protect his own pride, but he owed me nothing. He owed the money to his real blood, to Chloe, and I was entirely on my own.
The physical sensation of that moment is something I will never be able to adequately describe. It was as if the gravity in the room had suddenly multiplied, pressing down on my shoulders, forcing the air from my lungs. The man I had spent my entire life trying to please, the man I called Dad, had just completely erased our connection. My mother, the saint I had worshipped, was suddenly a stranger who had lied to everyone. I looked at Chloe, expecting to see shock on her face, but she just looked bored, as if she had known this dark secret for years. I did not scream, I did not cry. A profound, terrifying numbness washed over me. I turned around, walked out the front door, and never looked back. I left my clothes, my childhood memories, everything. I just kept walking down the dark suburban streets, the night air biting at my skin, completely, utterly lost, adrift in a world that suddenly made absolutely no sense to me whatsoever. I walked for miles until I found myself standing outside Sarah's small apartment complex. I pounded on her door at 2 a.m, shivering and hyperventilating. When she opened the door and saw my face, she did not ask any questions.
She just pulled me inside, wrapped me in a heavy fleece blanket, and made me a cup of hot tea. We sat on her worn-out thrift store couch, and I finally broke down. The sobs tore through my chest with such violence that it physically hurt. I told her everything. I told her about the betrayal, the stolen money, the horrific revelation about my parentage. I cried until there were absolutely no tears left, until I was just a hollow shell sitting in the dim light of her living room. I felt entirely hopeless, convinced that my life was over before it had even truly begun. My dreams of college, of architecture, of a better life were all burned to ashes in a matter of minutes, leaving me with nothing but a suffocating sense of grief and profound abandonment. But Sarah refused to let me wallow in despair. The next morning, as the sun began to peek through her blinds, she sat across from me with a fierce look in her eyes. She told me that crying was not going to get my future back. She said that my father might be a cruel, vindictive man, but he was also arrogant, and arrogant men make mistakes. She asked me specific questions about the college fund. How was it set up? Was it just a regular savings account, or was it something more formal? I realized I had no idea. I had only ever taken his word for it. Sarah slammed her hand on the coffee table and told me that was our starting point. If my mother had set that money aside specifically for me, there was a chance she had protected it legally. Sarah insisted that we needed to find out the truth, not his twisted version of it, but the actual documented truth. She ignited a tiny spark of anger inside my broken heart, a spark that told me I was not going to go down without a massive, brutal fight. That spark quickly grew into a raging inferno of determination. I was not going to let him destroy me. I moved into Sarah's spare room and took on extra shifts at the diner to pay for rent and food. Every spare moment I had during the day, I spent at the local public library, researching financial laws, inheritance, and probate records. It was incredibly overwhelming, a massive labyrinth of legal jargon that made my head spin, but I refused to give up. I started making phone calls, tracking down the bank where my mother used to do business. Because I was legally an adult and I had my birth certificate and my mother's death certificate, the bank eventually agreed to speak with me. The customer service representative on the phone sounded confused when I asked about a standard savings account. He put me on hold for what felt like an eternity, and when he came back, the information he gave me changed everything I thought I knew about the situation, flipping the entire situation completely upside down. He told me there was no regular savings account. My mother had set up a formal, irrevocable trust before she died. She had named my father as the trustee, but the document specifically named me, Emily, as the sole beneficiary. The money was legally locked and intended only for my educational expenses or to be released to me entirely upon my 25th birthday, which had passed a year ago. The representative explained that my father had no legal right to cash out that trust and give the money to anyone else. It was a massive breach of fiduciary duty, a literal crime. When I hung up the phone, my hands were shaking so violently I dropped the receiver. My mother had known. She must have known the truth about my paternity, and she must have known that my father might try to abandon me. She had legally built a fortress around my future, and he had arrogantly broken the law, thinking I would be too stupid and too broken to ever look into it, assuming his authority was absolutely unquestionable.
Armed with this earth-shattering information, I knew I needed professional help. Sarah connected me with a lawyer she knew from a previous legal issue, a man named Mr. Davis. He was a 60-year-old attorney with a sharp mind and a no-nonsense attitude. I walked into his cluttered office, my heart pounding, and laid out the entire story, along with the notes I had taken from the bank. Mr. Davis listened in silence, taking meticulous notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he took off his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and looked at me with a grim smile. He told me that what my father had done was not just unethical, it was blatant fraud and theft. He explained that as the trustee, my father was legally bound to manage the money for my benefit, and by giving it to Chloe, he had exposed himself to massive civil and potentially criminal liability. He agreed to take my case on contingency, but I still had to work 3 exhaustive jobs for 6 months just to cover the massive filing fees. Finally, the day arrived when Mr. Davis filed the official lawsuit against my father. The legal complaint outlined the breach of trust, the misappropriation of funds, and demanded the immediate return of the entire amount, plus damages and legal fees. I will never forget the evening my father was served with the papers. I was in the middle of a dinner rush at the diner when my cell phone started ringing endlessly. It was his number. I stepped into the back alley, the cool night air hitting my sweaty face, and answered the call. He was screaming so loudly the phone speaker distorted his voice. He called me ungrateful, a thief, a liar. He demanded that I drop the lawsuit immediately, threatening to ruin my life, to make sure I never found work in this town again.
I let him scream until he ran out of breath. Then, with a voice as calm and cold as ice, I told him I would see him in court, and I hung up the phone, feeling an incredible surge of power coursing through my entire body. The panic set in for him very quickly after that. The legal discovery process revealed exactly what we suspected. Chloe had burned through nearly half of the money in a matter of months on luxury vacations and a failed boutique. My father had used the rest to pay off his mounting credit card debts. They had squandered my mother's legacy on their own selfish greed. Desperate, my father and Chloe ambushed me one afternoon outside the bakery where I worked. They looked frantic, the arrogant smugness completely wiped from their faces. My father actually tried to hug me, begging me to settle outside of court. Chloe was crying real tears, complaining that the lawsuit was ruining her credit. She told me we were sisters, that family should not do this. I looked at her, remembering the smirk on her face. I looked at him, remembering his cruel rejection. I stepped back and told them they were not my family. I told them to direct all communication to my lawyer, and I drove away. The day of the mediation was tense and claustrophobic. We sat in a sterile conference room in downtown, the air conditioning blasting. My father looked 10 years older, the stress etching deep lines into his face. His cheap lawyer looked defeated before we even began. Mr. Davis laid out the terms with ruthless precision. Because my father had stolen funds from an irrevocable trust, he was facing serious consequences. To avoid a brutal public trial and potential criminal charges for fraud, my father had to agree to liquidate his assets. He was forced to sell the childhood home, the house where he had treated me like a servant for over a decade. He had to drain his retirement accounts and hand over the equity to make me whole. It was a complete financial devastation for him, the absolute destruction of the comfortable life he had built on a foundation of lies and theft, and I sat there watching it happen without a single ounce of pity in my heart. When the mediator slid the final settlement agreement across the large mahogany table, my father's hands were shaking violently. He picked up the pen, hesitated for a long moment, and signed his name, officially surrendering his wealth to me. Chloe sat next to him, her face pale, completely silent. She knew that without his money, she was going to have to actually work for a living, a concept that terrified her. I signed the documents without a single tremor in my hand. When it was all over, my father looked up at me, his eyes filled with a pathetic mixture of anger and defeat. He opened his mouth, perhaps to hurl one last insult, but I did not give him the chance. I stood up, thanked Mr. Davis, and walked out of that room with my head held high, leaving them sitting in the ruins of their own making. I had reclaimed my future entirely on my own terms, proving that I never needed his validation to survive. The aftermath was swift and poetic. The bank transferred the settlement funds into a secure account under my name. It was more than enough to cover my tuition, my living expenses, and to finally give me a sense of security. I quit my exhausting jobs. I threw a massive dinner party for Sarah, buying her the most expensive steak in town to thank her for saving my life when I was at my absolute lowest point. 2 months later, I packed my bags and moved to the city to begin my architecture program. My father, having lost everything, was forced to move into a tiny, rundown apartment and take on a second job just to survive. Chloe's car was repossessed, and she ended up working the graveyard shift at a local gas station. Occasionally, I get a blocked text message or voicemail from them begging for help, but I never listen. I simply hit delete, block the number, and go back to designing my beautiful new reality, leaving them as nothing more than distant memories in a past I have completely outgrown. Looking back on that horrific night in the living room, I realized that his cruel rejection was the greatest gift he could have ever given me. If he had just handed me the money, I would have spent the rest of my life trying to earn the love of a man who was incapable of giving it. I would have remained trapped in that toxic dynamic, forever playing second fiddle to a sister who despised me. Instead, his betrayal shattered my illusions and forced me to discover my own immense strength. I learned that family is not defined by blood or legal documents. It is defined by loyalty, love, and the people who stand by you when your world falls apart. People like Sarah, who showed me what true support looks like. My mother's love saved me from beyond the grave, but it was my own resilience that forged my ultimate victory. If you found out the people who raised you stole your entire future, would you have the courage to fight back and burn their world to the ground? Until the next story.